I'm delighted to welcome you today to our Ashton Rediscovered masterclass. This afternoon we will have a detailed talk from our distinguished speaker, Jane Pritchard, Curator of Dance for the Victoria and Albert Museum. We are thrilled that we have two luminaries from the ballet world to coach the Act 3 Sylvia pas de deux and teach the female variation today. Dame Darcy Bussell, who really needs no introduction, President of the Royal Academy of Dance, a former star of the Royal Ballet, and now a principal coach and presenter of the Royal Ballet and Opera Cinema Relays. Coaching alongside Darcy, we have Donald McCleary, former principal, ballet master, and principal coach with the Royal Ballet. What is really rather wonderful about what we will witness today is that Donald coached Darcy for many years and prepared her in this role of Sylvia when the ballet was revived by Dame Monica Mason and Christopher Newton in 2004. The pas de deux has been taught by choreologist Daniel Kraus, who is with us today and will be updating the Benish notation score to ensure that we continue to dance as closely to the original as possible. Darcy will teach the variation live. The Royal Ballet dancers working on the Sylvia pas de deux and variation are first artist Amelia Townsend and soloist Giacomo Rivera. And at the piano we're fortunate to have Michael Pansters, pianist of the Royal Ballet. Lastly, I would like to thank Kevin O'Hare and all his staff at the Royal Ballet for their continued support in making these events possible. And now over to you, Jane, so we can hear more about this classic full-length Ashton ballet.
Well, good afternoon, and it's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you for those lovely introductions. So today we're looking at the pas de deux from Act 3 of Sylvia, which has been described actually as the best pas de deux by Ashton by the time he created the work in 1952, which of course leaves us all open to have other favourite pas de deux, but this is, I think, a very, very beautiful pas de deux. So this is actually originally danced within Act 3 and it was created in 1952. It was also a work that from very early on was slightly reworked so it could be taken out of context and be presented very much as a showpiece pas de deux. So it has that sort of duality to it in a way. With some sort of alterations, sort of thinking about how you make things really work. It was choreographed for Margot Fontaine as Sylvia and also Michael Soames as Aminta. And they were a cast that I think has been hard to beat. I think we have seen some wonderful dancers, and I would never say you can never top something, but I do know that people who saw them in the roles were certainly thrilled by them. So I think that is a very important starting point. And I think also, when something is created on you, there's always an essence of that dancer that remains within that role, whoever takes it on. So for the work, Ashton was very dependent on the music by Delibes. So this is 19th century French music. But of course, there weren't necessarily quite the arrangements as wanted. So Aminta's solo came from La Source in terms of the music, original choreography completely separate. So Ashton's Sylvia is premiered on the 3rd of September 1952 at the Royal Opera House. Of course, the company was still the Sadler's Wells Ballet then. It had an enthusiastic response from the audience. According to one report, there were 19 curtain calls, so it's not bad. However, it had fairly mixed reviews, so the reception from the press was not entirely positive. And I think it's, again, as with many works, it's one that was adapted, was changed, improved, and I think that is actually something, you know, it wasn't a finished production perhaps on the first night. There were improvements to be made. It's also a ballet that went through a number of changes. new pieces were added, sections were changed, the whole thing was reduced into one act, so really doing an Aurora's wedding on it, if you like. And then, as mentioned, in 2004, it was gloriously restored to us, complete, and I think that was wonderful. And although of course Frederick Ashton was no longer around to be involved, the fact that he had already explained what he wanted and thought about changes so that it could be really his vision brought to life, I think was important. I think it's also important that this is the second, if you want to say, full programme work. I mean, I know we talk about full length, what does that mean? A one-act ballet is full length, or full evening, well, what happens if it's performed in the matinee, but never mind. A complete programme in one work. And this was discussed when Ashton was thinking of putting on his first full work, which of course was Cinderella. It was decided to go down the sort of Cinderella route. I think probably Cinderella, a much, much better known story than Sylvia, so that was going to add to it. Although there were very serious discussions in *47 about mounting Sylvia. Richard Buckle, the critic, who liked to be involved in rather more than just dance criticism, had written an entirely new scenario for it. And in those 40s, the late 40s, he was very sort of, I'm going to say interfering, in what was being sort of put on. He had his very strong ideas how things ought to be developed, but certainly it was chosen to do the Prokofiev music and Cinderella. In fact, at the time, '47, when Sylvia was being discussed, Richard Buckle had commissioned Ivor Guest to write a substantial article about Sylvia, which wasn't published at the time, but did appear in March 1951. And I think that may as well sort of help to sort of put the idea back into Ashton's mind, not that I think it ever went away. There were plans for the company to mount its second long three-act ballet, and I think Ashton put forward the idea of doing Romeo and Juliet. That was then vetoed by Ninette de Valois, who said you couldn't possibly do two Russian Prokofiev ballets. Tell that to an audience today, and any company today. But anyway, that apparently was really, so Sylvia was turned to again. I wouldn't say Sylvia was a second choice. I think it was a work that Ashton was fascinated by, but had found quite challenging. I think the thing is that the narrative is not very strong. There is an awful lot of music for the corps de ballet. To me, one of the delights of the work is actually the richness of the corps de ballet. It may not be the most inventive choreography, but it, I think, is very impressive. And where some of the critics were saying, you know, this is not terribly original, well, I think slightly less original Ashton is a lot better than many other choreographers. So the whole ballet is based on a poem from the 16th century called Aminta, so the name of the, quote, hero. So this is by Torquato Tasso, so not a story that people know. And I would say that for most modern audiences, the whole sort of idea of classical mythology is a bit bewildering, so not necessarily sort of something that they are familiar to. But Ashton really decided to base it very much on the original production in terms of he took the narrative more or less straight as it was from Paris. And the ballet had been created as a showcase for an important ballerina there, so Rita Sangalli, who came from Italy. She was Milan trained, and she was really, I think, very much quite a technical dancer. She was very much admired, and I think it suited her very well, because it's quite interesting. After she retires from the dance, the ballet almost fades away, although through the 20th century there will be different stagings at the Paris Opera, and indeed they have just produced another one. So it's something that's part of their heritage that I think they do feel sort of quite strongly about. But I think this whole business of it being a multi-act ballet is interesting. At the time that Sylvia is mounted, so 1952, a lot of the critics start saying, oh, we're returning to the full evening ballet. Returning to? I defy anyone in Britain to find any ballet, apart from one, before the 20th century that is a full evening ballet in isolation. That's not how things worked over here. Because dance history is written moving from one country to another, you get a distorted impression. And so people look back and think of what was happening in the Imperial Theatre in St. Petersburg and in Moscow and think that was the norm. It wasn't. People didn't go and see long ballets. So as far as Britain is concerned, yes, they'd been seeing the classics thanks to de Valois bringing those in. They had seen the only ballet from the 19th century, which was Excelsior, as standing alone. And then, of course, you know, there was sort of the sort of gradual introduction. But also, in Paris, you didn't have long ballets. When Sylvia went on, first of all, it created an outrage. First of all, there was no répétition générale for the patrons to go to. And secondly, horror of horrors, it was put on without an opera. There were 3 performances and then they had to put an opera back on the programme because the audiences just weren't happy. So this idea of ballet standing alone is really, outside Russia, a very 20th century idea. So I think that's one of the sort of things we need to sort of think. So it's not so much sort of returning to what happened before, it's moving in a new direction. And yes, of course, a single title is probably a lot easier for marketing purposes, so one can understand that. There were quite a number of other elements in Paris that were sort of surprising, one of which was the fact that the vision of Diana and Endymion at the end of the work was actually presented as a projection. Now, projections are quite common in the theatre these days, but it was a relatively new development. It had been used in opera, but apparently the audience thought this was hysterically funny. And it was like the illuminated signs of the new department stores. So one can sort of see certain techniques were not actually sort of fitting into place in the way that perhaps they hoped for. It is often said also this is a work that links back to the period when most of the male roles were performed on travesty, but that's not the case in the original Sylvia. Yes, Eros was, but only Eros. Aminta was played by Louis Morante, who also choreographed the work. I never think he can have been a very great dancer. He doesn't have a dancer's physique by any means. And he wasn't the greatest of choreographers either, which was probably one of the handicaps. Orion was played by an Italian dancer, Magri, and in those days, Orion was described as either the black or the dark hunter. Now, apparently his makeup was very heavy, but I don't think he actually blacked up for the role. He was really trying to appear as the wild man of the woods. So Ashton has really sort of changed that role quite considerably into very much more of an oriental figure. Given the characters and given sort of the ideas behind this, nothing is very, very specific. But as I say, really the starting point is Delibes' score. So Delibes, sometimes referred to as the father of modern ballet music. He was admired by Tchaikovsky, who apparently said he would have been very nervous of writing Swan Lake if he'd heard Delibes' score before it. And it was a score that I think Ashton admired. He did admire French music. If you look at how many works he does to French music, it's quite striking. And it's interesting that he had the previous year choreographed Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe. And I think with both works, it was that sense of he wanted to bring these scores back to the public. I think, to my mind, Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe suffers from the fact that I have a hunch that Ravel was looking at the traditional French ballet scores when he wrote that, because structurally it's not the easiest of works. And it's that sense of a long celebration at the end that keeps going, which can be marvellous to watch, but my God, must be challenging to choreograph. So I think there are elements that are similar. And of course, Ashton himself said, well, actually the stories are the same, because in both cases you have a young couple separated by an outside force, the pirates in Daphnis and Chloe, Orion in Sylvia, and the heroine is only saved thanks to the deities coming to the rescue. So the men appear rather weak, and I think that's sort of inevitable. It does, however, offer a sort of sense of strength in some senses to the heroine. So for those who are unfamiliar, just sort of give you a very quick outline. The 3 acts. The first is in the sacred wood, in which Aminta comes to see the statue of Eros at the shrine. He has seen Sylvia and fallen in love with her, and so he's trying to get another glimpse. Sylvia is a nymph of Diana, Diana the goddess of chastity and hunting, and so she is somebody who is devoted to both of those. By the end of the act, Sylvia will have been abducted, Aminta shot, but brought back to life by divine means, and essentially the scene is set for the second scene in a rocky grotto, or Orion's cave, which with the Sadler's Wells production was described by Cyril Beaumont as being a bit like Kew Gardens. I'm still trying to work out how we got to Kew Gardens, but there we are. I think possibly because originally there was a sort of a structure over the cave that was a bit like a greenhouse. That's the only way I can see it having any sort of link with Kew Gardens. Never mind. That's how it was interpreted then. So in that, basically, Orion is trying to seduce Sylvia. She is standing back, ignoring all the offers of gifts, and then suddenly she has this bright idea, let's get him drunk, and so he's incapacitated. And I would mention, I do in the film with Darcy's expression, I just think it's wonderful the way you managed to capture that moment. The change when she's sort of being put upon and terrified by this man, and then suddenly thinking, I can do something about it. It's very, very vivid. So that's just a nice thing. So at the end, you've got your drunken Orion and his cohorts. Sylvia is stuck in this cave, or whatever it is, Kew Gardens, trying to get out. And what happens? Well, you need Eros to come along and save her again. The final scene is by the sea coast with the Temple of Diana and a feast of Bacchus. So this really sort of brings us to a celebration, excuse for a celebration. We have a number of the characters from sort of Greek and Roman mythology, Apollo and the Muses, all 9 of them this time, Persephone and Pluto, and you have 2 sacrificial goats. Now, I know some people have complained that they don't like the goats. I think they're rather fun, and very much you can sort of see how they sort of fit into traditions of ballet. And I think that's one of the things. You have your great celebration, and then you finish the story after the celebration, which is a slightly unusual construction, because after you've had the pas de deux, after you've had everyone celebrating the Feast of Bacchus, Orion turns up, tries to sort of take Sylvia back, but Diana intervenes, and she tries to stop Aminta. Oh, sorry, I should have said that Eros had basically taken to Aminta, who was happily at the festival. She tries to divide them, Diana, her concern for chastity, but Eros again saves the day by conjuring up the vision of Diana with Endymion, with whom she had fallen in love. So she had fallen in love with a man, human man, and therefore she is forced to let the couple live happily ever after. Now, in terms of Sylvia, I think it's, to me, it is quite interesting that it's a work that gets picked up early on. It is performed in many European cities. It also, by 1884, is being seen in the United States of America. I've never seen this discussed in any of sort of the histories of Sylvia, but it goes there. And it was staged first in a 1-act version, and on that version, it had the Aminta was a dancer called Theodora de Gillette, who a couple of years on, so she has been dancing, she's a Russian dancing in Britain, goes to America with Her Majesty's Opera. So Britain's sending things over to America. They hadn't done Sylvia here, but so Mapleson's company puts it on there. And then a couple of years later, the New American National Opera puts it on. And de Gillette moves from being Aminta to being Sylvia, which is a quite slightly unusual arrangement coming through. She did actually more often go for the travesty roles, but she was very tall and described as a queenly dancer, so she does fit in. So it is a work that's picked up quickly. It goes to Russia. It's performed in St. Petersburg in 1901 with Pierre as the heroine in a staging by Ivanov with Goethe. In Britain, it's first seen in 1911 at the Empire Theatre in a production that's supervised by Wilhelm with Lydia Kajast as Sylvia and the travesty role Carlotta Massetti as Aminta. And apparently, when Ashton was rehearsing his work, these two dancers were brought along to see how he was developing it. What I've not been able to discover anywhere is if they made any comments or observations about it. But I've also sort of thought it's quite sort of interesting as a production, because to me, what Ashton is doing is really looking quite seriously both at how ballet has developed in the 20th century, but also acknowledging ballet from the late 19th century. So, for example, at the opening with the nymphs, they've got their sort of garlands of flowers, which are actually like sort of ropes of flowers. And this, to me, takes me back to his Cupid and Psyche, and then, not Cupid and Psyche, sorry, what am I thinking of? At the ballet club with the skipping ropes, which I'm sure he picked up from when he was in Paris with Ida Rubinstein's company. I think that year in Paris, he must have had some real awareness of what was happening at the Paris Opera, because various things actually do feed into his choreography. And I do also think you get, when the country folk come on, and they're down as peasants in the programme, but I don't think I'm allowed to call them peasants anymore. So they come on and they all have their prop with them. They even have wheelbarrows, they have little lambs, they have rakes and hoes, and they're all dancing around with these. Now, if you're dancing around with a prop, it means you can't do an awful lot of épaulement, and your arms are sort of stuck. But then they carefully put them all down aside, and they carry on dancing in a much more 20th century fashion. And again, with the muses, for example, they've all holding a prop. So I think these, looking back to what happened in the 19th century in a very sort of subtle way, and bringing it in, but not really using it. So it is very much to sort of the detriment of the choreography. I think, to me, it is quite a clever balance that has crept in there. I know there's quite a lot of comments, you know, what the hell are they doing with those wheelbarrows in a ballet? But if one sort of looks at it from a historical perspective, it certainly makes sense. But really, the most important thing is, I mean, a lot of the choreography is beautiful. The fact that it has been restaged, I think, so beautifully is important. Restaged, I think, with an understanding how you need to adapt things for a different period of time. So it's really a gap of over 30 years without a performance is really quite a substantial gap. And it has been performed beautifully by so many dancers. But I do think one's got to go back to those principles. Michael Soames, when the work was choreographed on him, had just been spending sort of the summer taking class with Valinin, who had actually been one of Anna Pavlova's partners. And it's often said that that really influenced the way that the choreography was developed for him. And I think, again, that then gives you an insight back into what his teaching must have been like. And undoubtedly, it was one of the great roles for Margot Fonteyn. Ironically, she doesn't mention it at all in her autobiography. And I would have thought it was an absolute treasure to have a ballet like that created on you. But I will just read what was said of the dancing. And it says, the section by Clive Barnes, this is in Dance and Dancers. On dancing it says, Sylvia is Fonteyn. The part has everything for Fonteyn. It exploits her every quality, her passion, her fierce imperiousness, her tenderness, her pathos, her womanliness, her bravura. It gives us Fontaine triumphant, Fontaine bewildered, Fontaine exotic, Fontaine pathetic, Fontaine in excelsis. The range of her dancing is unequalled. The heart-splitting significance that she can give to a simple movement is unsurpassed. The whole ballet is like a garland presented to the ballerina by her choreographer.